Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Platform events are for admins too. I'm Steph Ramos. I'm the events manager here at Internet Creations, and I'm really excited to be with you all. Thank you so much for spending the next 45 minutes or so with us today. So before we get started, I do want to get to a few housekeeping items. I'm really excited about the next thing that we have coming up for you, so save the date. We are launching Service Camp next month at the end of July, July 20th through the 31st. So Service Camp is going to be 2 weeks where we want to help you get more out of Salesforce. So we'll be offering free one-on-one coaching with a whole bunch of our consultants from our professional services team. So you can ask them all of your tough questions or help them. They'll work with you to figure out a project that you're working on, or anything that you're working from service, getting more out of Lightning to developer console if you're getting into that. We did a session a couple months ago on that. Or maybe you're looking to implement chatbots and live chat and public knowledge base. Anything that your heart could desire, our consultants can help answer your questions. So
no ashtrays? You're not going to make ashtrays or have archery classes in this camp?
No, so this camp is a little bit different, Mark. So we won't be doing canoeing or anything like that, but we want to help you get more out of Salesforce. And so this is why we're launching Service Camp. It's a little hokey, whatever. I like it. I'm into the cheese. So that's launching July 20th. If you're interested in learning more, let us know. Post a question in the chat. I'll make sure that you get added to the list. So when registration goes live next week, you guys can be the first ones to scoop up your spots. Okay, so let's get on with it. Today's session is platform events for admins too. And so I am really, really excited to introduce to you this incredible human. His name is Mark Budson. He's our manager of professional services. He is an absolute goofball, and I adore working with him. And on top of that, he's a 16-time certified Salesforce architect. What? That's crazy. Mark, thank you so much for presenting today.
Thanks a lot for having me. I'm excited about this opportunity to share platform events, and hope you guys heart platform events the way I do.
Yeah, he is going to nerd out with you today. Okay, so let's get on to a couple more pieces of housekeeping. We want you to ask questions. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, yes, this webinar is being recorded, and yes, you will get a copy tomorrow. I know that's like the first question that people usually send to us. So that I can answer for you right now. So besides that, we want to test this out. So if you have questions throughout today's webinar, today's session, please let us know, but let's test it out. Where are you tuning in from? Where are you calling from? So we have two headquarters here on Internet Creations. Our main headquarters is in Hamilton, New Jersey, which is right in the center of the state. Yes, New Jersey has Central New Jersey. It is a thing, and it's we fight really hard about. And then we also have offices out in Dallas, Texas. But as many of you are probably working from home, I know I have been since early March. I'm here in Point Pleasant, New Jersey, enjoying the Jersey Shore, getting my son on. And Mark, where are you located?
Actually, the central part of Central Jersey, lovely Metuchen.
Yes, awesome. I like it there. They have a nice little train station over there.
And a great downtown, lots of great restaurants.
Mm-hmm. And they just opened out outdoor dining in New Jersey just as recently, so you can go and enjoy that finally. We're free from quarantine. Okay, so let's see where people are tuning in from. So I'm looking at the questions box right now. It seems like y'all know how to use it. This is great. So we have people tuning in through San Francisco, Dallas, Nashville, Albany, New York, Dubai. That's amazing. Look, we are international here at Internet Creations. Pennsylvania, South Dakota. this is absolutely so great. Keep the questions coming throughout. I already see some going in, and then we absolutely have time to get to them at the end here. So without further ado, Mark, on to you. Let's talk about platform events. Let's tell the audience what they've won.
Thanks, Stephanie. All right, well, would it be a Salesforce presentation or training or anything Salesforce related without this forward-looking statement? I assume everyone's seen this. If you've been to anything Salesforce related, if this is your first Salesforce related event, training, information exchange, collaboration, this is what's called a forward-looking statement. Obviously, title gives it away. It's essentially a disclaimer. What it's indicating or telling you to do is make sure you make buying decisions around products based on what's currently shipping, not any forward-looking or future-looking statements. And that's pretty much the crux of it. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about today around platform events and streaming. So here's our agenda. What is streaming? What's PubSub in relation to streaming? We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk specifically about how Salesforce implements streaming. And I don't mention platform events, but platform events is part of Salesforce Streaming platform, and that's why we're going to start off a little bit about streaming before we start diving into all the awesomeness that's platform events. And we'll talk about 3 uses that platform events can have for admins. And then we'll talk about some allocations and considerations and some useful links, and then Q&A. Those links will be in the presentation, but we'll also be pushing those links out into the chat so you can grab them if you want to. All right, so I have this little quote from Heraclitus. I can't pronounce his name. No man ever steps in the same river twice is the key part when you're talking about streaming. So because streaming is actually about a continuous flow of data. Now, when you're streaming, you're probably thinking of Hulu, Netflix, and those media streaming sources. And that is a kind of streaming. We're talking about a little bit different streaming. We're talking about between multiple systems. So while both streaming information, Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, whatever, is streaming that video or a TV show to you specifically. This kind of streaming between systems is a little more agnostic. It doesn't really care. We'll talk a little more about that in a second. But keep in mind, streaming is a flow of information that's continuous. That's flow of data, and it could be drips or torrents of data, and it's on a channel. Okay, the channel specifies the theme of the information, what it's about, and there could be many channels. So streaming actually has all that stuff in there. Now, that's great. That's describing the stream, but how do I manipulate the stream? How do I do that? That's the challenge, right? How do you actually manipulate and work with that data that's flowing in that continuous stream? So how do I do that? How do I get the stuff I care about? How do I put stuff into that stream? Well, I kind of already mentioned something called publication subscribing, or PubSub. And if you do want to sound like a cool kid, it's PubSub. That's what people refer to it, and it's a pattern. For those of you not familiar with what pattern means in the computer science context, it really indicates it's a recognized best practice approach to solving a particular problem. There are certain themes or problems that recur frequently, and over time, they've developed some really good solutions that everyone's generally agreed, yeah, that's a good way of solving it. And PubSub is one of those patterns. So when I have a stream of information, how do I consume it? Well, and how I put it out there? Well, the idea is you have a publisher and a subscriber, and they're really good analogy to help understand that is a radio broadcasting and radio stations. So the publisher is the radio station. So they broadcast a signal out, and you have these different buildings and people in apartments with radios tuned in and listening to those actual radio. That's that information being broadcast from that radio. Now, these could be all different radios all over the place, and this is considered basically the one channel you're looking at. This one radio frequency is the channel. So a subscriber could be tuned to that frequency and have the radio on, and the information is received. That same subscriber could have the radio tuned to a different frequency, to a different channel. So they're picking up information from that one. Or the radio's turned off. They're not listening at all. The data's still flowing on that channel. It's still continuous. So modulating your radio to that frequency is a way of saying I'm subscribing to that actual flow of information and having your radio turned on. So that's what PubSub is all about. And it's very common and used quite a bit of places inside in the computer world, including in Salesforce, which we'll get to in a few moments. So let's get to a little more specifics on what's the benefits of PubSub. Well, first benefit, dynamic real-time applications. Like I mentioned a moment ago, the radio station is broadcasting a signal. So it's real time. So as soon as that broadcast signal leaves that radio station, almost immediate, the radio station's picking it up. In the same example of radio station, you have one publisher, many clients. You have one radio station and many radios, right? So that's pretty efficient. You don't have to worry about the different clients. And in the computer science world, there's a concept called fire and forget, and that's what this is. The radio station sends off the signal, fires off the information, broadcasts its music or news or whatever it is, and doesn't care about what happens to that information. That's the same thing with PubSub and streams. It publishes information on the actual channel and doesn't really care about what happened to it. It's up to the subscribers to care or do something about it. Clients can subscribe to many channels, right? So you could actually have, now in radio station, you really can't do that with the radio analogy you mentioned earlier. You can't have more than one frequency because that sounds really awkward or awful. But in computer science, you could have multiple clients or one client subscribe to many channels to get information from different sources. And again, a channel could be themed. One channel could be about information related to a sales process or information related to something going on with cases or whatever you want it to be. So you can have different channels with different themes if you wanted to. And the last item, and we're going to talk about this one more than once, is loosely coupled integration between systems. So this whole streaming stuff in PubSub is really fundamentally originally about having two different systems or one and multiple systems talk to each other, integrate. And you can have tightly coupled integrations, which means that the source system, the publisher, the one is sending this information out, needs to know a lot about the target system. And the target system needs to know maybe a lot about the source system. So that's really tightly coupled. That makes for things to be a little fragile. If one of the systems changes, things could break and so forth. A loosely coupled integration means I don't need to know as much about the source and target. It's loose. And that's what's great about PubSub. Like I said earlier, it's fire and forget. The publisher sends his message down and doesn't care what happens to it. And the subscriber just gets the message, doesn't care what the publisher is doing in between or anything else. Long as that subscriber has the message or has access to the channel to get the message, there it is. So that's basically what benefit of PubSub is from a loosely coupled integration. And we're going to talk about that some more in a little bit. So now, where on earth does all this stuff fit within Salesforce? So Salesforce has this umbrella term called the Salesforce Streaming API. And they use basically a PubSub streaming within 4 types. They refer to them as types of options. Okay, and they're divided into 2 generations. The first 2, generic and push topic, have been around for a little while, and they're considered first generation. And then the second generation are change data capture and platform events. One of the things to know about the first generation ones, they're very developer centric. You need to write code to be able to leverage those 2. Even to create a push topic, you have to write some code. Generic really requires quite a bit of code to make it work. However, the second generation ones, while they can work with developers and code, can be absolutely manipulated and managed as an admin through the interface. Let's talk about change data capture just for a moment to kind of close the loop on that one. Then we're going to focus on platform events. Change data capture is really cool. What it allows you to do is allows you to publish your changes on an object out to an external system. So the idea behind that is if you enable change data capture for your account object, for example, and someone goes in there and modifies the account name, automatically Salesforce will broadcast that change out on that channel. And the channels are named, actually. The little slashes underneath each one is the naming format each of those different types follow. So if it was an account, it would broadcast it on data/account change event, that change on the account, the name change, for example. So and it's really easy to set up. It's really push button. And you can just say, hey, I want to monitor changes on this account or this object or that object, custom objects, whatever. It'll make it work. So that's what change data capture is. Sometimes you hear it referred to as CDC. And then finally, we have platform events, which we're going to focus on, which allows you to actually do exact same thing, subscribe to it, broadcast information on it. What's really cool about platform events, so it's a little bit different than the rest of them, is you can actually control the shape of those events. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment, but that essentially means you get control more about what's going on in that event message that gets sent out, right? Now, all these different types of PubSub streaming technologies are referred to as Salesforce Enterprise Messaging Platform, and it's built on top of these same core standards and technologies that most other internet-based PubSubs work on. There's a couple different technologies. So it's all the same base technology. What Salesforce has done is created different ways to work within those technologies to create tools for us to use to broadcast in different ways these messages we want to publish on these streams. So let's talk about platform event. Well, platform event isn't a regularized object. So why is that the name of this slide? Why are we calling it out? Because when you first look at it, and we'll look at it in a few moments, you almost wanted to call it an S object because the UI looks very similar when you're creating one of these platform events. And it is a little bit like it. So you can create it in setup, and we'll show you guys in a little bit what that looks like. You can create custom fields on it. You can insert records, declaratively or through code for these platform events. And you have some control over read and write and read and create permissions. So it's like an S object in that sense, but it isn't. Don't get caught up in that. Don't allow yourself to think about it as an S object because it isn't. There are some definite differences. So platform events are actually not S objects. They're actually called definition entities. Technically speaking, an S object is a entity of one kind. Platform events, it's its own type of entity. So it's a platform event. And when you create a platform event entity, you're actually creating the streaming channel to be used. So creating that object, that platform event entity, is the actual channel. And it's not a record though. When you insert a record, you think about in a record, it's actually a message. And it does look different than an actual record does. And you cannot see these messages in the UI. There's no standard component available to view those in the UI. You can create some fields, but certain types of fields you cannot create on a platform event. Lookups, for example, master detail relationships, complex fields. Standard fields you can, and we'll see that in a little bit. And because it is still part of standard streaming technology, external systems can subscribe to those changes. And what's really cool about Salesforce has done is you can now also subscribe directly within Salesforce to those channels. So this is one of the big benefits of platform events, that you can actually subscribe to it internally without using an external system or having access to it. The other thing to call out about these messages, remember, these are the records, but they're really called messages. They can't be changed, or you cannot delete them yourself. So they're not editable and they're not deletable, but they are purged automatically, depending on a couple of different factors, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. They're last either for 24 or 72 hours, depending on dependency on API versions and stuff like that. But essentially, they're going to go away. They're transient. Don't count on them sticking around. All right. So again, don't think of these as S objects. They are different, and they do behave differently as a result of that. All right. So then, why should platform events go into my awesome admin toolkit? Well, I kind of started poking into those reasons, and let's kind of coalesce those and put them together. Because you're able to control the shape of the platform event through custom fields. Control the shape is kind of a way of saying, I could control exactly what I include in these platform events. The other kind of types don't give you that much flexibility, actually. So platform events gives you a lot more flexibility. So you can actually pass data in that message itself, besides the fact that message occurred. And you could do them declaratively. You could actually use a process builder to send a message. And as I mentioned a moment ago, you could subscribe to them through that external exposed channel, that link I showed you earlier, that /event/name. That's how you can subscribe to them externally. But also Salesforce automations can subscribe to them too. Triggers can, process builders, and spoiler alert, as of summer 20, flows can too. And there's also a couple of useful platform events that Salesforce has standard available. And they're also loosely coupled. And that's a really major use case that we discovered is pretty useful. And we're going to talk about that right now. Before we get into that detail, let's talk about what a Salesforce transaction is. So we're all on the same page, we're all aligned, right? So in a Salesforce transaction really represents all the stuff that's happening together on an event that occurred. So an event that occurred could be someone updating a record, okay? So if someone goes in and updates a contact record, for example, changes, let's say, a phone number, that could obviously trigger off a bunch of different things. That could fire off a workflow, a process, a flow, a trigger, who knows what. A bunch of those things could fire off. And I've seen that happen. I've seen organizations that have process builders and workflows all in the same object fire off. So all those different things firing off, all within that context of that one change, is part of that same transaction. Now, let's say that trigger I mentioned a moment ago in that contact record is being fired off, fires off some additional code that updates an account. Well, because that context is still within that same transaction, that account change is part of that transaction. Now that account changing may fire off on the accounts and process builders, workflows, triggers, who knows what other automations too. So that other additional stuff gets included in that same Salesforce transaction. So now we have this cascade of these transactions all adding up based on one single change on a contact. And this is standard functionality. This is exactly how Salesforce will work. Now, if you guys, you can tell that's cascading, it could actually go crazy and snowball. And that's why Salesforce has those governance limits in place to make sure things are controlled and no one abuses the platform that we're working on. So keep that in mind. So a transaction can span multiple objects. So contact changes, makes changes that could impact an account. That account could even have some other stuff that goes to a custom object. Who knows? It depends on the environment you're in. But it's all under one transaction. Okay, all that same user fired that off. All that stuff is basically in that user's context in that single transaction. So let's go come back in a few moments why that's important. So now let's talk about that here in a little more detail and where a platform event message could be kind of helpful. So in this example here, we have a transaction scope on the left side around this process builder around a specific object, and it's firing off in the user's context. So if that user makes a change and that process builder fires off, and that process builder publishes a message, a platform event message, that is actually splitting the transaction to two. So we're actually ending the user's context transaction, and now we're engaging a second transaction that's independent of the first one. So we're actually able to split the transactions. It's kind of useful, especially if you have governor issues, because now you're actually starting over again with the governor issues, excuse me. So that helps you split that out. Now, one thing to note though is that the user context, this is kind of important. So the user context for the transaction scope actually switches. So it's no longer the user that fired off, it's actually the automated process on behalf of the user. That's in the published message. So if you're ever doing some debugging and stuff like that, it's important to remember that. The other benefit of publishing a message is you could have multiple process builders or automations listening for the message and firing off. So if you ever want to debug it though, make sure you keep this in mind that you need to debug it based on the automated process user. But it does actually work in the context of the user that fired off. It's kind of a weird thing. And if you're debugging stuff like that, keep that in mind. So now, taking all that juicy goodness together, and let's explore a use case that we encounter. So our professional services team was working with somebody on this issue, and we came up with an interesting solution to it. There might be other ways of solving it, but this is the way we solved it without getting involved with code. So this is a real life use case we encountered, and we're actually going to walk through this in a moment. So when a user deactivated, sales user in this specific use case, any context that they own has to move to an active user. All right. So the original design was to have a process builder on user fire off when the user was deactivated or inactivated, and mass update the contacts that were owned by that deactivated user. That's a pretty reasonable approach and makes sense. But the problem was, is as soon as they did that the first time, they started getting this mixed DML operation errors, making changes up. And we'll talk about that in a second. So the design was two processes, okay, to fix that, user and platform event one. So let's get into more specifics here. So this is the original design that was put forth actually through the error. We'll look at it in a second. So we have the entity, the S object, which is the user object, and we have actually two automations. We have a process called deactivated user and a flow called update contacts. So let's actually take a look at some of this stuff right now, for example. So we have this flow right here, sorry, process builder, excuse me, and this is the process builder we're talking about. So it fires off on the user object, and it checks to see if the user has been deactivated. So is active is changed, and it went to a false value. Okay, and it simply calls a flow, and the flow has a variable called var user ID, and we're passing in it the ID of the user. Totally makes sense. So here's the actual flow that's being called. It's pretty straightforward flow. It gets all the records that have that inactivated user as the owner. It loops through them all. For purposes of our demonstration, we're actually hard coding a specific user to replace them, but in real life, we would have actually done either metadata or something else, or known the user wasn't passed that to. But in this example, we hard coded the ID in here, but we looped through all those contacts, and after looping through them all, we update the contact records. So that's what the flow is doing. Okay, so again, user gets changed, the process picks up the change and invokes this flow, and the flow updates those contacts. So I am here in my test environment, and you can see these are all the contact records that are in question. I know we have these really lovely naming convention here, and this is all test data, but these are all the contacts that exist, and they're owned by Jojo. Jojo's a salesperson that's no longer with the company and left, and we have to reassign. So there's all Jojo stuff in here. So now if I go into the user record for Jojo and inactivate Jojo and save, I'm going to get this error message. This is really an unfortunate error message because it doesn't tell you anything. It's pretty useless. And if you look at this error message, try to figure out what the problem was, it doesn't tell you, it gives you any insight at all. However, thankfully, we have it set up so any errors are being sent to the admins of the system. So I actually have in here, let me pull up the error message. It showed up my email clients. I'm gonna put it in Notepad just so we don't get cluttered with other noise. So this is the actual body of the error message. It's really, really, really more helpful, but still overwhelming. So you can see this error occurred, and it happens multiple times because it's looping through trying to create this operation. Okay, it's looping on here. But what's important to know is it's a mixed YAML operation. On setup object is not permitted after you update a non-setup object or vice versa, contact original object user, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what does this really mean? Okay, this is the actual error that's occurred when we tried updating the contact when the user deactivated. Salesforce in the same transaction, hey, see, that's why we talked about transactions earlier, does not allow in the same transaction for setup and non-setup objects to be edited or manipulated or updated somehow. So what's a setup versus non-setup object? User is a setup object. Non-setup objects are like the contact or account. Other setup objects would be user role, profiles, and so forth like that. Why does Salesforce do that? It's actually, it's a security thing. It's to help make sure that no one nefarious goes in and the same transaction changes someone's access to do something they shouldn't have done. So Salesforce splits the transactions, doesn't allow it. You have to split the transaction in 2 different events to do that. So that's what the error is. Close this window. All right, so then how do we solve this problem? How do we get rid of that issue? Well, we solved it actually by revising the design a little bit and taking advantage of platform events. So we're still using the same deactivate user process, just another version of it. We added a new process called subscribe to user update, and that listens to the platform event called user change. So platform event user change is broadcast by deactivated user revised. It's a new version of it. And this guy picks up and it passes in the user ID into the update context flow. The flow hasn't changed at all. So that's the actual change we made leveraging the platform event. So let's first take a look at a platform event and see what it looks like. Let me open it up here on my screen. All right, so this is the user change platform event I just mentioned a moment ago, and you can create a new one if you want. I'll just do it really quickly just for example purposes. My platform event. I'm all for really clever names. There's an option here called publish after commit and publish immediately. I would recommend always publish after commit versus publish immediately. And that's actually a relatively newer addition to platform event functionality. Publish after commit means after the database has committed all the other changes that are part of this transaction. Publish immediately means the platform event message gets pushed on the channel as soon as it's been notified to send it out. The problem with that is sometimes that it may trigger off other events or transactions or automations that need to go back and find a record that's been created as part of this transaction. They may not have been committed yet. So I think in most use cases that I've come across, it's publish after commit's the one you want to use. There might be some use cases I'm not familiar with that publish immediately might be more useful for, right? So I'm gonna leave that as is. And here's my platform event. The big change is this _E at the end of it, not _C. Again, this is not a custom object, S object. This is a different entity. It's a platform event, all right? A couple standard fields. Again, it's really easy to think of it as an S object because it looks a lot like an object setup screen. You have a created by, created date, but there's no auto numbering field. There's something different called replay ID. Replay ID is an important part of streaming protocols or standards, and then that it actually allows you or automatically sequences the messages being published. That way, a subscriber can actually go back and look in the channel and replay the order they're in to make sure they have in the correct order. So that's not really something leveraged directly inside Salesforce's automations. That's more for external clients who are listening to those things, but that's what it's about. But for our purposes, for Avid purposes, you could think of it as kind of like an auto numbering ID thing. Now down below here, you see custom field and relationships. That's exactly what it sounds like. Though no relationships are available, I could create these kinds of items. Let's say I wanted to create a text field. And you'll see it looks very similar. Let's call this, let's say I was doing this for the contacts. That's how I call this contact ID. And I know contact IDs are 18 digits, and same thing like most other fields and other objects, you can create them in standard and so forth. Also tells you what triggers and if you have any automation subscribed to the actual platform event. All right, that's it. That's pretty much what a platform event looks like from that point of view. Again, they're not as objects. You won't find them under Object Manager. They're actually under integrations and setup. And let's take a look at the user change one, which we are going to be using today. So pretty much what we talked about a moment ago. Well, there's two fields on here, not one, and there's a subscription as a process listening to it. The fields, user ID. Well, since we're actually trying to pass the user ID over to the flow, it makes sense to capture the user ID on there. That totally is reasonable. We should do that. That's what I mentioned earlier about controlling the shape of this. I could add more fields to make sure I have the right data in the platform event message. That way, whatever's subscribing to it can get and do what it wants to with it or what it needs. But I also have something called update type. Now, I'm in professional services. I do a lot of design and solutions, and so does our team. And one of the things we try to do is always consider things down the road. Things could change or evolve or be reused. Businesses need to be nimble and need to pivot. So one of the things I was thinking about when I designed this was include an update type field, which is a text field. The idea behind it is because this is a user change platform event, not a user was deactivated. I could have made it user deactivated, but I chose user change. I can actually use this user change platform event for other types of changes that may eventually be necessary to act on. So having update type field allows me to pass not only the idea of the user change, but maybe some kind of classification describing what the change is. So any item subscribed to it, any processes or automation subscribed to it, know what kind of change it is. And if they need to act on it, they can, otherwise they could disregard it. So that's why there's an update type in there. So that's the platform event user change. Okay, and the other change we made is we actually changed the activity user process builder. So let's go back here. This is the old version of it. So let's go look at the new version, version 4. Yeah, there was a version 3 in between. I made a mistake. My bad. Let me activate it before I forget, because this is the one we're going to be using in a few moments. And it's awfully familiar looking. It checks on the user object, same criteria here. The only difference is that has a different action here. So I'm calling the flow, invoking the flow, it actually creates a user change record. That's the platform event, user change. And I just call it broadcast user change. And I put an update type, that field I mentioned earlier that describes it, just to have it for future proofing what it's doing. It's deactivating the user. And in here, I'm passing the user ID inside of it. That's the whole process builder that's in this one. Now there's a new process builder called subscribe to user. This is the one that calls a flow. So let's take a look at that one. So this is the one that's fired off on a platform event. So platform event is user change. I have to, in process builders or processes, I have to tie it to an object. So I'm using the user object in this situation. And then I'm saying which fields to invoke and use in there. And in here, there's no criteria. Now, if I was actually going to use that field I mentioned earlier, a type field, I would actually maybe put a filter in here to make sure only those that are deactivation get processed. But in this case, for demo purposes, I'm not worried about it. I want them all to pass through. And you can tell here, I'm actually firing off the flow I mentioned earlier, and I'm passing in the same variable the user ID that's been passed on the platform event. So now, the user object hasn't changed. We have a new platform event. This process actually publishes that. This guy picks it up and calls a flow. So let's now take a look at it and see how that works. So let me bring over now, again, the contact records. These are all still owned by JoJo. We tried updating a second ago. And over here is JoJo again. So I'm now going to hit deactivate. The only difference is besides those new process builders and updates in the platform event is I've activated the one that publishes. So I'm going to hit save. And if I remember to activate it, which I did, I don't get an error message. So that's great. So now it ran successfully. So now if I refresh this view, all these JoJo should be owned by somebody else. And they are, no error message. So the beauty of that was I was able to use a platform event to actually split the transaction into two, right? So that's why there's a little dotted line in here. So this is all one transaction, the process, subscriber, user update, and the update context are in a completely different transaction. I was able to cross that line and not run into those issues. Now, another use case that we encountered with one of our clients, and we've simplified in this conversation here, is with a survey. Now, Salesforce, Internet Creations has this really great tool called Simple Survey. If you haven't taken a look at it and you're looking at surveying folks, you should take a look at it. It's pretty easy to use. It allows you to create surveys and send them out. And what Simple Survey does, and most survey tools do, is they create a survey object to store the survey questions and the answers in. In this use case, we had to associate the account, the contact, and the case to the survey. Now, in this specific use case, we always had the account. The account existed. That was never a problem or a question. That was passed with the survey. We got that. Awesome. The problem is that the requirement requires the case to be tied to the contact who completed the survey and the survey record, but the contact may or may not exist. So, and the case has to tie the two together. So the problem was we had some flows, we couldn't always control the order when the flows are firing off to make sure, because flows could do that really easily, but we weren't sure in the order they would fire off. We actually wasn't always consistent, nor do we have the resources to involve coders or put together some kind of ETL tool like a Boomi or Jitterbit or MuleSoft or something like that. So what we decided to do is use platform events and a concept I like to call tag. That's my name. I was trying to be clever. There might be a better name out there for it. If you know an official name for it, a best practice name, I'd love to know it. So here's that scenario, kind of more laid out better. So the idea here is we have a new platform event called Managed Survey. And that's what the little bar on the bottom represents. The channel that's going to go in there. And what actually happens is we have an automation that sits on Survey that whenever certain changes happens, it pushes a message out into the channel. And that message, the shape of that message, because there's a platform event, we control the shape, we could pass whatever we want in it. We're passing potentially the survey ID, the record of the survey, the contact ID, and the email address of the contact, because that email address would come from the survey. We would have that at least, right? So again, how do we solve the problem of knowing what to do with what? We want to insert the case ultimately. Well, the idea is when we publish that, if we don't have the contact ID but the email address, then what actually happens is those two subscribers, if the contact ID is not populated, the find create contact automation fires off and insert case ignores it because that tag, you're it, find create the contact now. So doing that, it occurs and fires off and contact gets updated and potentially the survey gets updated. And if that happens, then the update survey automation fires off publishes another message, this time including the contact ID. And the insert case one, now listening for it, picks that up and processes it, it creates a case record, now tying them all together. So using the same platform event, we're actually able to decide when we care to action on it or not to action on it. So another benefit of platform events, it's called playing tag. So a way to get your brain wrapped around it. Now, another third use case for platform events, besides those two solving those kind of problems, is the fact that Salesforce has now some standard platform events, and they've been rolling out other ones too. These are 3 standard ones that are kind of available right off the bat, which are kind of useful actually. And if you're an admin monitoring system, you may want to look at these. So the names kind of tell you what it is: batch apex errors, full execution errors, platform status alerts, and so forth. So you actually get notifications when these things actually happen if you wanted to. There are a bunch of others. I think there's like 15 or so total. Some of them may not be available because they have to either based on licensing some other products, or you have to enable a feature to see those. But 3 are available pretty much right off the bat. So again, if you want to monitor your batch apex errors, this might be one way to do it. That way you're notified when it actually happens versus having to go check your log files. All right. Now I kind of mentioned it before, summer 20, platform events are going to be now available to be fire off flows. That's huge because previously you had to fire off a process builder, and that process would then fire off your flow. So that's a huge improvement. And this, again, Salesforce's relentless march to making flows superhuman and process builders not as relevant anymore. And that's kind of been obvious, like some of the writing on the wall we've been seeing is Salesforce is investing a lot to make flows better, and it's showing. So the fact that flow can fire off in a platform event is really cool. So keep that in mind. Okay. Now let's talk about some of the other issues around platform events or considerations around platform events. Durability. Okay. So there's 2 kinds of durability classification Salesforce uses: standard volume and high volume. So I mentioned earlier different types of streaming types. Generic and push topic are standard volume. Those messages store for 24 hours. Change to capture and platform events are stored for 72 hours. With the one exception, if you created your platform event before Spring 19, they're actually live for 24 hours. So that's how long they last. That's it. They're gone after that. So don't count on them sticking around forever. Streaming allocations and considerations. So things to think about here is how many you're limited to using and creating and stuff like that. So based on what edition of Salesforce you're on, there's this whole number of platform event definitions you can create. So 100 for performance unlimited, 50. I mean, obviously you guys can read this. I'm not going to read them all out loud. Maximum number of concurrent Comet D clients. Comet D is one of those technologies I mentioned earlier. Salesforce built the streaming stuff on top of. These are subscribers. So that's the different subscribers who can listen for messages. Okay. Across all channels and event types. That actually means 2,000 across change data capture, across platform events, across generic, and across push topics. It's combining them all to one group, 2,000 records. Okay. Now, 2,000 connections. Maximum of processes that can subscribe are 4,000. Active is 2,000. So that's kind of, you got 4,000 inactive and active, but 2,000 could be active at one time to subscribe to platform events. The Comet D client is external, right? Event delivery. This is one actually we've encountered with one of our clients, and we kind of come up with some interesting solutions around it. 50,000. So you cannot deliver more than 50,000 event notifications with a 24-hour period shared by all the clients. That means across everybody. So what that also means is that means who's consuming the message. So that's just the way that that's written is not, this is Salesforce's language, is a little not 100% clear. So let me put it this way. If you have 5 users or five systems subscribing and they each receive 10 messages, they've consumed 50 notifications out of the 50,000, okay? On some large organizations we support and work with, we've hit that limit. Now, Salesforce does offer an add-on license that allows you to increase the limit by another 100,000 if you wanted to, okay? So these are some of the streaming allocation considerations you should be aware of, and we have links to these pages in the link section. Speaking of, so here's some of the useful stuff and links you want here. These are probably obviously ones, the Trailhead, Trailmix I put together. It's a couple of really quick little ones. Some more deep information on defining platform events and so forth. The one I do want to call out is the second from the bottom. That's actually a pretty useful one, especially if you're dipping your toes in streaming or you really want to get involved with it. So normal UI does not allow you to see those messages. This is an actual component through an AppExchange called Streaming Monitor that allows you to see all those events as records, messages. So you actually should suggest, if you're trying out platform events and streaming, you want to get your toes wet, damp, whatever you want to call it, definitely recommend taking a look at that app and installing it. However, it's subscribing to that message. It's consuming those notifications. So that the number I mentioned earlier, it does count against it. Now, if you're not a huge org, you don't have a huge volume, that's not a big deal. But in large organizations, it could be potentially an impact. So keep that in mind. Minimally, I definitely put in your sandbox. If you're playing around with it and then you're starting out in production first time, maybe then uninstall it. But definitely take a look at that one when you have a chance. The other thing I want to call out, that platform events is being used not only within Salesforce platform, but Salesforce is using it to actually share information between Salesforce and Marketing Cloud. So some of the journey builder notifications between Salesforce and Marketing Cloud use platform events. So platform events are being used in lots of different places, and they're consuming some of those actual messages, also those notifications. All right, that's pretty much it. What I was going to cover. I know we have a bunch of questions out there, but I do want to tell you that hopefully this session helped you understand why I heart platform events as much as I do. And now turn over to questions. Stephanie.
Great, Mark. That was awesome. Thank you so much for walking us through that. So we do have a couple questions that I want to get to. So the first question here is just a re-explanation on the why behind why we need to use platform events when, from this person was saying, you're only updating the owner of the contact from that first demo.
The reason we use platform events is because the mixed DML error. Remember, it's a transaction problem. It's a Salesforce limitation. Since we're changing a setup record on the user, and that same transaction is triggering off an automation to update the contact records, we're crossing that boundary between setup and non-setup. Remember, Salesforce does not allow us to change setup records and non-setup records in transaction, security precaution. So by using the platform event, we're able to actually cross that bridge by having one transaction, which is tracking the fact that the user got deactivated, and sends a message essentially, lobs it over the fence to another process waiting to hear it, go ahead and do something. So we separate into two separate transactions by lobbing the ball over the fence from one to the other, getting around that mixed DML error problem. I hopefully answered that. Does that help?
I think you did. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Ruth says yes. Thanks, Ruth. Okay, so the next question we have is, can you explain another why question, which we love the understanding the why here at Internet Creations. So can you explain why, in what scenarios you would want to use Apex code to publish events versus just using configurations like the process builder and platform events?
That's actually a really great, deep philosophical question. No, it's a really great question.
Who would have thought we would have gone into philosophy here?
There's a couple of contributing factors. So let me repeat the question and help me get my brain organized a little bit around it. So essentially the question is, should we use automation? Should we use code to solve a problem, right? And this is in a situation, platform events is one of the things you would use to help solve the problem, but declarative or code-wise. It's interesting, and so again, I'm in professional services, we're consultants, we work with clients all the time, and we build solutions both ways. We have two teams, and they work tightly together, and we do things declaratively, do things programmatically all the time, and we also certainly have solutions that do both. The answer is who's going to be, the first thing is the org, how are they managing that solution? Because all solutions, all tools, all processes that we build change. Businesses are nimble, they change, they pivot, right? So what are the resources available to manage that solution when the business changes or something has to change? Are there developers in-house? Okay, I mean, that's honestly a contributing factor. A lot of organizations don't have developers in-house. They may have a couple admins. Or they have developers, depending on the size of the organization. So that's one of the contributing reasons you would think about it. Now, there's a technology reason too. So sometimes you want an organization that's super complicated, has a lot of layers of automations going on. Like I mentioned earlier, that transaction example where I said you have the workflows and process builders and flows and then triggers and on top of that. That's usually not a good idea because you have a lot of different places to manage things. It's usually a better idea to try to have everything using the same technology, but again, it goes back to the question of who's going to manage that. So you've got to find that kind of happy bridge in between those two things. So the general push with Salesforce is try to make things as declarative as much as possible, so it's easier to manage and maintain. So, and there are certain situations or certain problems you can't solve declaratively. There are some technical things that just declaratively can't do that would require definitely Apex to solve it. I'm a huge fan of Apex. I've written much code in my previous lives. So I'm not disparaging that, but I think it's more about how the organization wants to manage that information or that data, those structures going forward, and try to make sure the organization is as efficient as possible. I know it's kind of a wonky question. It's a fuzzy answer because it's really a lot of contributing factors that can actually determine how you answer that question.
Right.
Did I help?
Okay, thank you. I think so. Nima, let us know in the chat if that helped. So this next question is, can you tell us how to actually subscribe from an external system to the Salesforce platform events? I think, so you started mentioning something in the resources, but can you go over that?
It's when you subscribe to it, it's actually just going to a URL. So long as you're,
okay.
Let me go back in my presentation here. So each of the different types of streaming types have their own unique URLs. So if you look at their platform events in the red box, it's /event/channel. So there's actually that's a URL you append to the end of your Salesforce's org, and that's the actual endpoint that the subscriber needs to use. So the channel would be the name, it would be the API name of the event. So if the event was sales updates, that you name the platform sales updates, for example, the channel name would be sales updates _E, because it's the API name you would use. Does that make sense? Does that address the question, or is that not enough information?
So this person is saying that they used that URL on a workbench and could not get the message, and thought maybe that they had to use misled middleware and not workbench.
Oh, no, you can use it you can do it from Workbench. I've done that too. Make sure check your case sensitivity. It is case sensitive.
Okay, so it's case sensitive. So maybe check that out.
All those names are case sensitive across all types. It's case sensitive.
Yeah, and if you want, okay. So yes, we could follow up with you, or you can follow up with us, whatever works best for you if you have additional questions on that. Okay, so this next question that we have is, in the process builder that you launched, this is the second demo that you were working on. In the process builder that is launched via platform event, there seems to be another action below the action that launches the flow to update the contacts.
Someone has really keen eyes.
What action was that?
Somebody has keen eyes. Okay, I'll have to reveal it. It's a test chatter post message to myself to validate it happened. Someone has great eyes to pick that up. I was wondering if someone would pick that up. Yep, that's all it is. Just a post a chatter. It's a way for me to validate that. What was that? What did they say?
They said, LOL, thank you.
Great catch.
Very good catch. So if you have more questions, please let us know. We'll be hanging out here for the next few minutes for you. And if anything pops up at the end, after this session, and you think about it, you can always reach out to us. We are here to help you. And again, we'll be next week, we'll be launching our Service Camp initiative, and we really hope to see a whole bunch of you on those one-on-one coaching sessions with our team. Mark is going to be one of our consultants who is offering up some coaching for you, and we have an amazing group of people on our team. Everyone on our team is so awesome, that is going to help you get more out of Salesforce, and we're all here for it. So thank you, Mark, so much.
Actually, I want to mention really quickly that I'm actually in the process of writing a blog on streaming APIs that gets bit more detail across all four of those things. It does focus more on platform events towards the end of it, but it's a three-part series, and does get into more nitty-gritty on these streaming to APIs. So.
Yep. So stay tuned for that. That's at blog.internetcreations.com. So when we launch that, you can always check it out. And Mark, you actually have a little series already started on data relationships, right?
Yep. So we have 2 posts up there. The third one, I don't know when it's going to drop, but it's going to be, it goes from beginning of what the data relationship is through standard Salesforce ones to those little stranger ones that not everyone's familiar with, including metadata relationships and external object relationships. So it's a 6-part series, including the intro. Dives into all those specifics and how they all matter and what they do. So.
Okay, awesome. Well, Mark, again, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us. You are always so great at sharing like a mentor with our team and with all of you who are tuned on to this call. So again, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar most likely tomorrow for you. And if you have any additional questions, we are here to help. So thank you, and we will see you so soon. Bye, everyone. Have a great day.
Stay safe.
Thanks, Mark.